With the varying mix of extreme sports titles that were released on the PlayStation, many series would opt for producing sequels to try and continue on the franchise's legacy. But for many of these series, as time went on, interest would start to dwindle in many ways, as new and upcoming franchises were starting to be born that for many would completely blow up and completely change the whole outlook and aspect of this unique genre. During the early days of the PlayStation or 32-bit console era, we had games like ESPN Extreme games and even 2Xtreme that for many were considered to be popular because at that time this genre was still relatively new and in its infancy, but hadn't grasped the full domain of possibilities with regards to graphics and controls and features. But that would later change towards the end, late 90s and early 2000s, that would see games come onto the scene that would literally become legendary in their own respect, that would go on to create massive franchises that would sell and make millions for games publishers and developers. However, during this time, while all these new games and franchises were starting to pop up, there were still some that were there and had been there for a while that were still producing titles, but while they did try to implement some new ideas, they kept to the original formula that was seen in earlier titles. But by that point, like I said, interest had started to dwindle, and that formula really just was not capturing the appeal of fans that were looking for something completely new, addictive, and just more in general. So by the time 3Xtreme came out in 1999, it fell into that category pretty much, because 1999 was a big year for extreme sports games. You had like motocross games, there was a load of snowboarding games already out at that point. You also had the birth and evolution of, quite simply, one of the most extreme sports series ever in existence with Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. That, for many, was the best extreme sports game on the PlayStation at that time until its sequel came out, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater 2, which, as we all know, is one of the best, if not the best, extreme sports game that's probably ever existed. But with 3Xtreme, it tries to recapture the same elements that was popular in the previous two titles, while trying to change up certain features, but it would also be the first game in the entire series to be developed by 989 Studios, but would also become the first game to use polygonal based characters and environmental elements for everything in the game. So essentially everything available that you could see in the game was 3D. That moved away from the 2D sprite based aspects of the original two games, and there was even motion capture features used, with professional extreme sports athletes also implementing many of the combos and trick moves that you would see in the game. But even with these elements, because it stuck to the same formula as the previous titles, that also led to the game's demise, which received very unfavourable reviews in magazines, as people seeing it as just more of the same while adding really nothing new. And if you've played the game, even if you take away the elements of the 3D graphics, it really is the same as the previous two games in all respects to it, just a bit more polish in some other areas. The game would also see some subtle changes aside from the graphics, with longer, more varied style tracks and environments. But again, with the reviews saying that it added nothing new, that even with all of the levels that were added, they felt kind of like dull and uninspiring, and that your money would be better spent looking for other alternatives, which fortunately enough the PlayStation had at that time many other titles that you could pick and choose from, with more upcoming games. Some of them would go on to be massive on the console. But even aside from that, while this would be the final entry in the Extreme series on the PlayStation, Sony themselves spent millions of dollars marketing this game to try and reach mass appeal, but it still didn't help in terms of its sales, so they actually lost money on this game. But like I said, by that point the game was already competing with new franchises and just better general ideas, as this formula, while it was good for its time, which I have covered on a previous video where we looked at the first game in the series, and the timing of that game's release was perfect and it was essential for the evolution and growth of the PlayStation. But again, by the time the third game came out, everything had changed, the whole landscape. In the space of only a couple of years, it's amazing how people's attention spans and people's ideas of what they wanted from games completely changed. So in order to stand out, ideas need to be original and spark interest, and unfortunately with games, if you can't do that, it's always going to fall into obscurity, and unfortunately this game did that. Now, it's not to say that it's a bad game in general, it is more of the same. If you played the previous two titles, you can expect very similar results, gameplay styles, just with a bit more visual polish. And if you're a fan of the series, it is definitely worth trying in most respects. But just, even I will admit, there are better games out there. Because once you've played through these games after a while, because the tracks are very wide and long, they can become quite repetitive after a while and will leave you with not really much incentive to keep playing. You won't get that issue with other games if you look at the likes of Tony Hawk's Pro Skater and other games like it. There's always many incentives to keep playing those games. But unfortunately, 3Xtreme is just another catalyst of games that tried to stay to its roots but just was overshadowed by everything else that was out there, and just the timing of the game itself just didn't appeal to the changing nature of the game's space or fans of the extreme sports genre in general. If this game had come out a lot earlier in the PlayStation's lifespan, say within the first 2 years, say between 95 and 97, this game would have appealed a lot more because there wasn't as many of those type of games on the system at that point. But it's amazing what a couple of years can do, how it can change everything. So unfortunately this game just fell by the wayside, even after millions been spent on it, which is a shame in many respects. But it is what it is, that's just the gaming landscape. Some games will hit home while others won't, and some series will go to live on while others will just slowly fade away, and this was one of those series, unfortunately. But it's still interesting to go back and look at these games in many respects. While they're not considered good by today's standards, they do pose an interesting idea as to the landscape of games at that time. While there was many new evolutions in terms of ideas and concepts, you still had games like this here that tried to do something slightly different but always tried to keep with the same formula, which I can understand their idea behind it, because if it works, why change it? But it really just depends on people's perceptions of games and what they actually want at that time. And while it may not appeal to everybody, it will appeal to a certain few. And for that reason alone, if you're a fan of the Extreme series, you can have a look at this one and see what you think for yourself. Or maybe there is fans of it out there, and if so, I would love to know your thoughts of what you think of this game and the series in general. Are you a fan of this series that dates back to the early days of the PlayStation, or did you prefer other type of series like Tony Hawk's Pro Skater or other games in that category? So be sure to share it in the comments below. And if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to leave a like, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell to be updated of future content. And if you would like to see more videos around other types of extreme sports games like this, also released on the PlayStation, then you can check out the playlist on screen to see more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.